to my Sand family for inviting me to this fiesta of death. I'm in the midst of writing a new book, and it's about my counterculture mom. And one thing we have in common is the loss of a child. My older brother died when he was 10 of cancer, and I was 7. And then my daughter died, as Lynn mentioned. So, we have that in common, and it's somewhat the thread of this book. But I was just thinking about what was I just saying? I just lost the thread of what I was saying. But um, anyway, that the themes of grief and death are very much with me as I move through this work around the mystics and the teachings of the women mystics, which is kind of the theme of this gathering today, this little short time we have together, is the way in which grief and loss strips our hearts and unveils them, so that we have this kind of renewed access to the numinous. I mean, I would trade every spiritual insight I've ever had for, another chance to be with my baby. But there is and there seems to be this phenomenon by which the experience of loss makes us naked. And with that nakedness of spirit, we're able to have an intimate encounter with the holy. So I'd like to read a poem by my namesake, Mirabai. This is going to be a contemplative time together where I'll be sharing poetry and we'll be breathing into it together a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit as well. So Mirabai was a 16th century mystic from India, a bhakti poet, a devotional poet who was madly in love with Lord Krishna, the god of love, crazy with love. I give my heart without fear to the beloved. As the polish goes into the gold, I have gone into him. Through many lives, I heard only the outer music. Now the teacher has whispered into my ears, and familiar ties have gone the way of weak thread. Mira has met the energy that lifts mountains. That good luck is now her home. As the polish goes into the gold, I have gone into him. So we're just going to take that in and just enter inward on the wings of those words and sit together for just 1 minute in the quiet, taking a few deep breaths and allowing ourselves to drop all the way in and just be here. Breathing in deeply, holding the in-breath for a few beats, breathing out completely, and holding the out-breath for a few beats, 2 or 3 times. This is from Lala, the 14th century Kashmiri poet. Lala, there's no birth or death. You are one, but not with happiness or difficulty, not with desire or anger. You do not walk with people who only talk about truth. The experience of God is continuous amazement. The experience of God is continuous amazement. If you're allergic to God language, just translate that word in any way that you wish. And this is what I want to speak to today, is this awe, this wonderment, this continuous amazement. When we are in the proximity of the fire of grief and loss, or the mystery of death and dying, we are invited into a space that is so alive and so saturated with the sacred that if we are willing to say yes to that, if we're willing to be humbly, quietly, or even riotously present to what is without getting bossed around by the conditioned impulse to see death and grief as something broken that needs to be fixed, as some kind of pathology that needs to be cured, but rather as a sacred landscape that is inviting us to enter. That very access that these rare but utterly natural states of dying and accompanying the dying and grieving invite us into, then in fact, they become opportunities for some of the most transformational spiritual experiences we can have. Now, tell that to someone whose, teenage daughter has just been killed in a car accident, or someone they love has just been murdered, or their parent has taken their own lives, or any of these traumatic losses. We can't say that to someone when they're just experiencing the fresh trauma of profound loss. But I think many of us, and probably all of you who are gathered here, it's probably one of the reasons you're gathered here, have experienced that access, that proximity to the profoundly holy space of death and grief, and know how it connects us with our soul's kind of innate longing for God, for the divine, for union with love itself. This time of year is, as I said, really charged with that feeling of the other world leaking through. And I want to suggest that we can engage our holy imaginations during this time, any time, but especially now, to cultivate an intimate relationship with our ancestors, to let them in, to call upon them, to bless them. And by ancestors, I mean all the unseen beings who go back in our lineages, both our own biological, genetic lineages, but also our spiritual lineages, but also anyone we've ever loved who has died. They become our ancestors. My daughter became my ancestor. Jenny died on October 30th, so we're coming up on the anniversary, the 19th anniversary of her death, and I feel her very much with me right now. But I've cultivated that intimacy through my holy imagination over the years. Jenny and Teresa of Avila are my two ancestors that I most call upon. When, especially every time that I step into a space where I'm asked to speak or teach or even write. Come on, girls, I need you. We can do this together. It's my team. We can't do this life alone. Here right now in this hemisphere, in this country anyway, the United States, and I know we've got an international gathering here, but in the United States, as Lynn and I were talking before we came on, it's just there's so much suffering right now. Well, there is all over the world so much suffering, but we're dealing with a certain kind of challenge to our privileged, largely white dominated reality, our coma, as Andrew Harvey calls it, our bubble. The wildfires and the racial justice and the election and the craziness around all of that. There's just a lot of reality to contend with. We need each other. We need our unseen beloveds to accompany us. So I'm going to give you a quick kind of, well, actually, I'm going to read you something from Teresa of Avila and then give you a quick kind of window into Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grieving, which I like to call transformational stations or portals. But first, to connect that kind of love longing and grief, I want to read you a little bit by my beloved Teresa of Avila. This is from the book of my life, her beautiful life story. So she was being investigated by the Inquisition at this time for all of these unorthodox visions that she was having that were kind of public, and the word was getting out. So the Inquisition, and she was first generation Christian from a Jewish family. So she was a conversa, from a converso family, and that was dangerous enough. But then with these wild experiences, she was really in a suspect place. So she decided she would investigate herself. So they didn't have to bother. I mean, they did bother, but she was doing the inner inquiry herself. His Majesty soon followed through on his promise, she says, to make it abundantly clear to me that my visions came from him. They weren't tricks of the devil or artifacts of mental illness. He made it abundantly clear that that my visions came from him. He began to increase my love for God to such a degree that I didn't know where it came from or how to obtain it. This love was supernatural. I was dying with desire to see God. I didn't know where to seek the life I was longing for except through death. Such powerful impulses of love coursed through me that I didn't know what to do with myself. Nothing satisfied me. I couldn't stand to be with myself. It truly seemed like my soul was being torn away from me. That's a description of that desperate love longing. It just feels like death. "O Lord," she goes on to say, "you supreme trickster, what subtle artfulness you use to do your work in this slave of yours. You hide yourself from me and afflict me with your love. You deliver such a delicious death that my soul would never dream of trying to avoid it." All the mystics of every tradition speak about dying before you die. That somehow we're invited to allow everything that we thought was the way it was to go and to die and to be deconstructed again and again and again so we can stay alive to the truth of what is. And there is no more powerful elixir that I know of than the fire of grief and loss to take us down to the ground again and connect us to what is most real. which is love. But our culture conditions us to get away from it. And so our practice is to show up anyway, to resist that tyranny. So I'm going to do this in 3 seconds. The 5 stations of grief and loss that Kubler-Ross identified, which were also the same ones she saw in people who are dying, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, all of which are unfortunate terms, and she said that herself toward the end of her life. It also sounds like some kind of linear process that you check, like a checklist, and you check them all off, and then you're over it. But what we're actually inviting ourselves into is not to be over it, but to allow the continuous process of transformation that is the gift of profound loss, to open us ever more deeply to the heart of love itself. So the one that I wanted to just touch on as we move toward taking some of your questions, and Lynn and I will start with a conversation, is denial, the first one. The other element of the denial experience that Kubler-Ross mentioned was isolation. So that is, in the face of a shattering loss, often we go into a dreamlike state, right? I know many of you are familiar with this. It just feels like this can't really be happening, that the news was wrong. You'll go to sleep, and when you wake up tomorrow, it will all have just been a dream. That we can't take, our psyche cannot take it in. There's an impulse in that first fresh experience of profound loss to isolate, because there's something in us that knows we just need a little space to turn inward and be with it, try to just come to grips with what happened. To me, this is one of the most important and profound experiences of loss, because it's not denial in the sense that rationally we don't believe what happened. It's not even a sort of biochemical shutdown that our brain does to prevent us from imploding with the intensity of trauma. It is also a space of grace, of deep and life-affirming grace. It's when we're so shattered that we're broken open, and those invisible angelic energies can come rushing in to hold us when we cannot hold ourselves. And that impulse to draw inward and to be alone and to just protect ourselves from the onslaught of sympathy and all the drama around a death or any kind of shattering loss. It doesn't have to be a death. It's like something in our souls knows that we need to just step aside from all of that and turn into that dark cave of the heart and be with it. So this is the element of the grief experience, the wonder, the awe, the experience of intimacy with the numinous that I'm encouraging us to say yes to as we navigate the landscape of loss in our lives. And if we are going through some kind of global dark night of the soul right now, a communal experience of shattering loss and profound not knowingness, which is one of the most holy elements of the whole grief process, is that it confronts us squarely with the truth that we know nothing. Then if we can do that together, if we can breathe into the fire of mystery together, I am confident that this time of potent deconstruction and collapse can transform us together back into a place of intimate love of the sacred and of each other, which is the same thing. So I'm going to end with a little poem by Rabia, the 9th century, I think she was, Sufi poet. Page 31. I carry a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. With these things, I am going to set fire to heaven and put out the flames of hell, so that voyagers to God can rip the veils and see the real goal. Rabia.